It's an honor to be introduced to you and also a pleasure. Indeed, I do study the cultural poetics of the German, energy transitions in general. I've written about Germany, but I've also written about Texas and fossil fuel extraction there. But I like writing about renewables because it's fascinating to see how renewable energy technology does and doesn't get taken up. And it's interesting what Helmut said about writing from a bottom-up perspective. When I began writing on renewable energy in northern Germany, all people were talking about was wind. No one where I was living was talking about the Energiewende, or the energy turn, even though that was in the late 1990s, early 2000s, and already the transition had been in the works for about 15 years. So it was surprising to me once I realized the disconnect between how it was discussed on the policy level and how it was discussed locally. Even beyond rubrics of protest or support, just this ambient engagement was fascinating, and so that's what landed me here. So basically in my work, I follow shifts in energy production, distribution, and use to see how they play out in expressive culture, and then draw upon that, just the poetics of everyday life, using theories of affect, using some STS perspectives as well as public culture studies, to think about how that affects politics, looking especially at things that are considered anti-political or illiberal, looking at how that shapes sustainability initiatives. And the book I'm working on right now, that is the working title, thanks to the RCC support, is an ethnography of public culture in a northern German community, well, in a county, in Unruly County in Lower Saxony. Actually, I have a map. Let me use this thing, so I work up here. So here we are, of course, and then I work right next to Unruly. And this area has been fundamentally, completely terraformed by wind, solar, and biofuel development. Of course, the energy transition also involves hydropower and some geothermal stuff as well. But up here, the federal subsidies for renewables have completely transformed this region. I have a couple of pictures in a second. And I'm trying to understand how this plays out in public culture and what that does, looking at offbeat things, looking at things that aren't about. Because there isn't a lot of protest in this region, in part, as I'll say in a minute, because a lot of things are said to be civic, even when they're not. And so I'm going to basically lay out the framework of the book, talk about what I'm doing, what my theoretical commitments are, and then give a few examples from one chapter, which is on looking at the transition and how it takes form in domestic settings, how people articulate their understanding of energy in everyday life. And here in northern Germany, as elsewhere in rural areas, domestic activities are everywhere in the world, but especially in villages where people still host a lot of social groups on a rotating basis. These conversations in the domestic sphere are really important for making sense of what this stuff does, who can get involved, who benefits, who suffers, if it's even registered in those terms. This is a place for workshopping emergent sensibility. These are also women-led interactions, which is really unique because, as I'll also say, women are not very visible in the transition. You often see job postings for cosmopolitan energy industry jobs that say things like, I will translate this into English, Frauenpower ist eine starke Energiequelle. We promote it. Women power is a strong energy source and we promote it. But this is about recruiting women into urban centers to work at corporations and not about bringing women into energy governance at the local level. Women are involved in that, as I'll show here, not only in terms of thinking about energy or feeling about energy, but in facilitating the social connections that make the transition possible, but they attain very little representation. So I'm trying in this chapter to bring that in. I'm especially thinking about how their actions constitute an alternate form of citizenship that doesn't necessarily align with liberal understandings of environmental concern, energy sustainability. So citizenship, as I use it here and in the book, is concerned with liberal democratic institutions, but it's also and more fundamentally oriented to ordinary, affective, and interactive aspects of social exchange, and how these politicize feeling in certain directions toward gatherings of people and things at different scales. So in other words, this idiom of citizenship allows me to consider how the Energiewende affects understandings of belonging and obligation and social possibility. And this is also informed a lot by work in public culture studies. I'm thinking here of Lauren Berlant, who talks about cruel optimism and attachments and how dreams are lived out in real life and how they fuel certain actions, going lateral, not conforming, and how that is nonetheless a political act. My use of citizenship also refers to the transition's aim to reinvigorate public life by bringing people into power generation. So for the transition's planners, Germany's path to sustainability lay not all the planners, but a significant faction of the planners lay not only in divesting the grid of nuclear power and fossil fuels. I forgot to turn this on, didn't I? I hope they heard me. Nuclear power and fossil fuels, but also decentralizing it, enabling communities to determine what kind of energy mix would work for them according to the environmental affordances where they were. So by this logic, if people were able to generate their own power and sell surplus energy back to the grid, their economic and environmental interests would come together, and they would be very interested in being part of energy governance, being very involved in local politics in ways that I think, especially in metropolitan areas like this, we don't know the extent to which rural dwellers engage politically in their communities. And so basically there's haunting the energy transition, especially in the early years of its planning, was this notion of energy citizenship, that energy democracy could bring Germans into a green, good life and make sustainability a right and duty of citizens, something that helped better the world, but also was the responsibility of citizens to maintain. So one of the things that I've been doing is trying to look at how these communities really come together as energy polities, not necessarily measuring them up against a yardstick of the ideal type, but asking, how does this really work out energetically, politically, in everyday life? And so this involves looking at all kinds of engagement, not just looking at how people invest or don't invest, or whether they stake claims by protesting. It's about looking at how people socialize and draw upon and appropriate energy and impressions of this technology in their interactions. But this work is complicated by the fact that the energy transition is problematic and marked by a lot of inequality. I mean, a lot of people came to me after the New York Times wrote an article a few years ago talking about energy poverty, that people in urban areas were unable to afford their energy bills because the cost of infrastructure was being cited as a reason to drive prices up. They had to convert the infrastructure to account for variable sources of energy, wind, solar power. And that's important, but equally important is the fact that when we talk about the energy transition, people often celebrate the fact that half of the installations that have been installed across Germany are citizen-owned, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they represent the people in the communities where they're installed. And so while many of these installations have done amazing things for achieving sustainability, and some of them have not, like biogas is problematic at the moment because it involves so much cultivation, among other things, people aren't necessarily involved in these projects. And so even though, and as I'll say at the end as well, the energy transition is currently changing yet again. And a lot of people are saying that the energy transition's dying, it's over, energy democracy is dead. My question is, to what extent was energy democracy ever achieved? Anyway, yeah, so, but what I wanted to say is, because each community has its own unique mix, and because many of these installations are locally owned, we have a sense that, oh, it's great, everyone determines what they want. But just because something says it's a civic wind park doesn't necessarily mean it is. The place where I lived has 2 civic wind parks that are owned by private consortiums. And they are taking over the entire area. No one there is angry because they see it as the province of farmers. But the price of basically participating in the energy transition comes at a price. It's an eco-capitalist endeavor. You can take part in wind parks, or in cases where civic wind parks aren't really civic, you can take part in wind turbine installation, you can install solar panels, you might be able to invest in a biofuel plant, but you have to have the social capital necessary as well as the financial capital. And that is negotiated through site-specific legacies of class, of social division. So yeah, it's an eco-capitalist project, and citizenship in that frame depends on investment, eco-capitalism. And so patterns of citizen engagement or disengagement reflect these regional legacies of wealth and inequality, either by, and these legacies shape the extent to which people stake claims on energy infrastructure, either by proposing new projects, agitating for access, or protesting them. The community at the heart of my book, which is again here near Aurich, is an example of this. So I should say a little bit more about the region itself. The East Frisian Peninsula hasn't looked like this for most of its existence because it has been flooded for most of its existence by the North Sea and continually reclaimed again and again by practices of diking and canalization. And because of that, land has been at a premium over hundreds and hundreds of years. And over that period of time, villages built on rises were surrounded by swamps and moors. This is an original peat extractive economy of peat. For the 200 years before this century, people were extracting peat in this area. And so people living there were antagonistic relations between those who were landowners, considered to be farmers, and those who were workers, who depended on the landowners for seasonal labor. And literally, they still use these words in East Frisian and Low German. They refer to the farmers as farmers, but they refer to the workers as Lutjelu, or small people, the kleine volk. And you hear that when they talk about each other. So people who are descended from these classes tend to fall in different patterns of energy investment because they don't have the social capital. People who were in the working class don't have the social capital to take part in wind park installation. It's also dicey because the people in this region found great social mobility in the German economic miracle of the 1950s. When this area industrialized and was reclaimed from the sea, people were able to commute to full-time jobs for the first time ever. And so there's a sense of class mobility independent of farmers, independent of land use, that shapes how people do and don't engage with land use in general. Now with energy development, and so there are still, at least in the performance of social relations, if not in substantive income levels, education levels, there's a performance of these two class categories that continues to this day: the land poor descendants of the working class and the descendants of the farmers who own land or who farm land through these social networks. And because the energy transition has taken shape through agricultural policy, through promoting biofuel farmed by corn, has appropriated land, has made leases with landowners who have farmed land, this is very much in this region seen as a farmer's project, not something that you're going to get involved in. And that also has a strong anti-political bent because people assume that the farmers will win if they protest that which is in their midst. So actually I have a picture from that's the town where I work. That is a new wind park. When I first arrived in this region, there were 20 wind turbines and I think 1 biogas plant. Now there are over 40 wind turbines. They're building a huge transformer station. There are 4 biogas plants. There is corn everywhere where dairy cattle used to be because milk prices are so low that people can make more money farming corn. And so the entire region has changed. But you can see here, so this is the community itself. This is an area that was reclaimed from the swamps. These are farms. The farms have all of the wind turbines, which, rightly so. And all of the wind turbines are located on the old moorland where they used to cut peat. So it's basically replaced one extractive economy with another. And then some of the wind turbines, as well as the biofuel plants, are on the sites of old windmills that farmers used to use to drain the region. And so it's thoroughly incorporated as continuing that legacy rather than being a new project in which many people can get involved. And I do want to say something about solar, because Hermann Scheer, the great architect of the idea of solar democracy, said, with solar power, everyone can power themselves. And that's true. And there are many people in the village, in this community, it's about 2,000 people. There are many people who have installed solar panels, about every 4th house, but they don't get involved in energy governance on the local level. They see that as a thing apart from the other technologies in the mix. They see it very much as a consumer choice. Through this Consumer Act, they too will become farmers of energy. So they are apart yet together in that situation. But while I was in the field, I observed that the people who were on the sidelines were deeply ambivalent in a way that was productive. They were implicated in these projects, and not only because they consumed the electricity that was harvested there, but because they were all also caught up in performance of this Rausch, this mad fury to develop. And it all contributed to the transitions unfolding, to piling up these ideas of who can get involved and who can't. And this happened in everyday conversations and like jokes and innuendo and gossip about people, which is always something that anthropologists encounter and get bowled over by. But it was fascinating because there was no touching what was happening on the policy level. People did not mobilize that into action. And you could see it because they called the wind turbines windmills. In so doing, they linked that legacy back to farmers. And so I've been looking at these processes, trying to understand what this does for people if it doesn't bring them into energy governance. What else does it do? And here working with women has really been interesting because, first of all, in a rural community like this, it was very hard for me as a field worker to access communities of men without a point of entry. I eventually made it and started hanging out at the actual private bars where they would hold investors meetings. Farmers hold meetings in private bars. But for a long time, I was only able to hang out with the women, and the women want to talk about all the things that are happening there and want to storify it, want to pull it and you into their narrative. And so it was very seductive in a good way. But what was really interesting when I was first talking to them is that they were saying, we're not really involved, we don't really have much to do, but they were hosting every gathering. They were facilitating all of the social connections. And because also in rural Germany as elsewhere, I think, not just in northern Germany, you have friendship circles, different circles that meet and that rotate from house to house. So you have like a wine circle, a Weinkreis, you have a Teekreis, a tea drinking circle, you have a Kaffeekreis, you have a breakfastkreis, you have sport friends. Now my friends have video game circles. They all meet and do these things at each other's houses. And because women are still very much in charge of the domestic sphere there, they manage all of that. They manage all of the opportunities where people can network in this village. And they also spend a lot of time thinking about class because they're the ones who maintain the face of the household. So they talk a lot about what would be the good life, what would look better, how would things work. I have some pictures of, so as part of the circles in village life, you have, at least in Ostfriesland and East Frisia, this idea of neighbor help, where when things happen, neighbors will support each other. And they have very clear sense of districts where each neighbor lives, each set of neighbors live. So when you are sick, when you die, when you have a baby, your neighbors are the ones who come and help. Your neighbors are your pallbearers. And neighbors also have to celebrate each other's birthdays when they move in. And this is a neighbor of mine who celebrated her 30th birthday. She is the daughter of a farmer whose family has taken part in the energy transition. They have invested in wind turbines. And she's being brought on a giant float through this 2,000 person village. And yeah, and they have a huge party, and then I don't have a picture of this, but it's hilarious. She had to clean the door handles, I think the door handles, because she's unmarried at age 30. So yeah, so I went to the preparations for this, and it was all, all of these investors and a few people who were sort of in the know but not part of the landowning class hanging out, and it was all administered by these women who knew everything. At any rate, without them, these kind of points of contact, these informal networks where wind parks are planned would not happen. Also, they bring all of the music, all of the things that you're supposed to sing. I once had a housewarming party because I had moved into the village, and they arrived with a giant heart and my name, and we all had to sing songs, and they distributed this stuff. These things seem sort of hokey or cornpone. It seems like President Obama pardoning a turkey. This is so important to making sure that people stay in touch with each other. Also throwing parties for children. They do all of this work, and all of these people are connected in this neighborhood. They all talk. These are actually all solar investors. So this is, this is real stuff that gets overlooked because it's, this woman is not wearing a hard hat. At any rate, this is just a cool picture. I couldn't find a friend of mine who is ambivalent about renewable energy technology. And her whole life, she says, consists of cappuccino and laundry detergent. And when I was looking for her, when I was home there last week, she wasn't there, and this was the absolute perfect image of the things that animate their economy of understanding renewable energy. But what else did I want to say? I want to talk a little bit about how these understandings of energy, how not just about the social connections that happen in these settings, but how they give rise to understandings of energy and how those become contagious. I have one story about another neighbor of mine on the left. Antje is what I call her. And Antje has a very interesting story. She is the daughter of seasonal workers from the village. She married a farming family. They stopped farming their own land and invested money. Then they lost everything and had to move back to this village, to her village. And everything was about, we used to have a villa, we used to be so wealthy. She's very, very sweet, hilarious, brilliant. But she never got to go to gymnasium, which is the elite high school, because her parents wanted her to marry someone. So she has a strong sense of her own rural modernity. And she began talking to me in energy metaphors. It just suddenly, like she came up to me and she was like, "You're looking very tired." And I was like, "Oh, thank you." Man, Germans. And she said, "You know, I have no elan." She said, "I have keine Energie." And I said, "What?" Because I have never, aside from Star Trek, heard a German person refer to their personal sense of vitality in terms of Energie. And I began to hear that around the village. And later I said to her, you know, she'd been struggling with psychosomatic issues and, you know, having the genre of experience where you go to the doctor and the doctor doesn't believe you. And she was like, "You know, I just can't seem to get into Gange. I can't get in gear." But I was really struck by this Energie, and so I began testing it out on different people, saying, you know, ich have keine Energie, I just don't have any energy. And her daughter came up to me and she's like, "You need to know, because you're an American, that you have to stop using the word Energie when you mean Kraft. Because no one, you know, everyone will know that you don't understand what energy is." And I was like, "Your mother just said it." So, you know, at this moment in time, their language is changing. And it's being used to talk about bodily capacity. It's being used at sites of frustration and loss and a sense of capital depletion, right? Not necessarily capital that we fetishize, but some kind of capital, some kind of purchase. Energy is being woven in there. Another story I want to tell, and I don't want to go on for too long. This is another picture. I wish I had a whole picture, but the other one that I have with the whole group is dark. I was in a breakfast group and a tea group with this one woman who is wonderful. She's the one with the persil and the cappuccino carton. And she and I have had many conversations. She is sort of, for the anthropologists in the room, we always tend to find liminal beings that tell us stories of how things are and why things are the way they are. And for anthropologists, perhaps the archetypal one is Mukuna the hornet from Victor Turner's studies of liminality. Mukuna lived on the edge of town. She lives on the edge of town. Constant storytelling. She has a set of greenhouses in the back. Actually, do I have them? Yes. She and her husband bought this old house. He works for a harbor authority. She is a homemaker now. And they bought an old house with a set of greenhouses that were ramshackle and left behind by, I think, a guy who grew pot in there and was arrested. It was so noir. At any rate, they bought this thing thinking they would convert it and how you'd have a business on the side. And it never happened. He and his brother, who had gone, they used to go cut reeds like their father had done back during the days of seasonal labor, and they had to take their vacation time to do this. And he quit, the brother quit, and her husband had no one to help him. And so it sits there as he tinkers around, sort of like Walter Benjamin in the French National Library. He tinkers and looks for projects and finds things to do with all of these materials. But she's always very frustrated. She also has a daughter who is fine, basically fine now, despite being legally blind. But for a while, her daughter has severe glaucoma, and there was a lot of fear about whether or not she would retain any of her sight. And so she stopped coming to at least our breakfast circle. And at our breakfast circle, people began talking about her cure, her daughter's cure, her cure to her misery, in installing solar panels. The solar panels would bring the good life because then her husband would stop tinkering. And then, you know, and it's funny because for years people had said to me, when are your old neighbors going to cover the glass houses? And I was like, you know, I don't think they ever will. And people were like, what a loss. What a terrible loss for them financially. And I was like, I don't, you know, especially people from the farms, you know, like, what a loss. And then at this one meeting of the breakfast tunton, as we called them, the breakfast ants, one of them said, well, you know, if she would just get renewable energy, it would be so much better because They would spend so much time, think of the vacations they could fund, think of the things that they could do. And this is, this whole discussion as the rest of us looked on. And then also a discussion, this is a tangent, sorry Helmut, about also doing new age therapies to find energies. So it's very consumeristic understanding of energy from people who would drive into the big city and get brochures from acupuncturists. At any rate, so this is all about this energy cure that she should take on, that she should live out. And it's funny because I once asked her, I was like, what about these glass houses? What do you think about solar? She said, oh, we got an estimate, but that's so expensive. Who's going to schlep away all of that crap? We would have to schlep it away anyway. It would be, she didn't say Sisyphus, but she was like, it would be Sisyphus in order to install these things that then we would have to maintain. And we just don't care. We just don't care. And so like Bartleby the Scrivener, she's not the only one. There are people who have the capital to invest, at least financially, can call people and say, what about solar? And they don't care either. So a lot of my work has been trying to understand the structure of uncaring as a productive one and looking at how this presence of such structures flies in the face of a normative idea of environmentally sustainable energy citizenship. What does it do to have this broken ruin that has its own life? These unruly energies that come out not just of the space, but out of the friction of people trying to understand what this is and making normative statements about what it should be. So that's why my book is currently and probably going to stay titled Unruly Energies, also probably because of Anand Singh, who probably inspired that volume. Because of this sense that things come out of this attempt, this social project, that are not reducible to liberal environmental aims, and they have a life of their own. This is actually my final picture before my conclusion, but these are some more pictures. This is her daughter, who has a garden in there and a play space and her own little swimming pool. This is her happy place. And she took me on a tour of it. I've known this structure for years, but she took me on a tour of it and showed me where I wasn't supposed to touch because of broken glass. This is very interesting to see a different order there, and also a very sustainable one because they never throw anything away, they constantly repurpose. And so even though this isn't about generating something, the contact between something like this and the way that it's then framed in terms of goodness, bodily well-being, I find absolutely fascinating. So for me, this is part of the way in which the renewable energy economy takes form, both reproducing inequality, but also throwing little beams of light up on other ways of being, perhaps shifting the attention so that we think about what that does in that space. That's pretty much all I had. I think that was probably 30 minutes, maybe 25. I mean, I had one quote that I want to read from Gibson Graham, the geographers, who in their work on social life in a mining community that had been disenfranchised from labor, they write, the view that the regional economy is defined purely or primarily by its energy resources prevails, but its exclusion from this instrumental vision that is today's subjection. And you could say the same thing of the East Frisian Peninsula at the height of renewable energy modernity. The energy transition is ongoing. Its industries are still relatively new. Again, I think rumors of, because they're now moving to a lot of offshore, there's a lot of hand-wringing about whether or not we'll see onshore sustainability. I think rumors of the energy transition's death are greatly exaggerated. But the patterns of engagement and disengagement and exclusion within it bear a surprising and often unsettling resemblance to prior extractive economies. And here life is marked by this view that the region is reducible to its energy and that it's okay not to be part of that. That you can live out your own life in opposition to that. And here too, this exclusion is normative, simply the latest in a long line of land development projects wrought by large landowners, state officials, and corporations that collaborate with them. But Gibson Graham would remind us this experience is continually reconstituted through performance. So if we're looking at scenes in which the sense of hegemony, of renewable energy's dominance in a certain way is performed, we can also identify ways of living differently that's, or as an anthropologist, Beth Pavanelli would say, living otherwise that seep out of those moments. And the anecdotes I've shared here illuminate emergent environmental subjectivities, particularly among women negotiating these class divides as they are reconstituted anew.
But they also more fundamentally reveal how senses of vulnerability and excitement get yoked to political projects and diverted in certain ways, giving rise to normative assumptions as to what you're supposed to do. And they also show that these things are fundamentally compositional, that there is a heritage of the past, that heritage of the past affects equity, but that also these scenes are the sites at which these things are reproduced. And I think that there are many ways to engage class in the German energy transition, particularly in rural areas, that have not yet been done. So I'm hoping that this book will open up that question, not only in terms of inequality and numbers on a page, but how that is performed and how people attach to that. Anyway, that's it. Thank you very much. Oh, I should thank people.